The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor, the moment Camille Duthers pointed at Marin and announced to the entire ballroom that the caterer's assistant had stolen a diamond bracelet from the silent auction table. Every head turned. 200 of Manhattan's wealthiest guests stared at the woman in the plain black uniform, her hands still dusted with powdered sugar. Marin Ashcroft felt her pulse climb into her throat, but she did not look away. She had spent 6 years learning how to disappear in rooms like this one, and she was not about to let Camille Duthers turn her into a spectacle tonight, not when she was so close to proving what she had suspected for months. "I didn't touch the bracelet," Marin said, steady even as her stomach twisted. She set down the tray of petit fours in her hands without a tremor, deliberately, buying herself a half-second to think, instead of flinching back from the guard closing in. She had seen exactly where the bracelet went. She had watched Camille's own cousin slip it into a coat pocket 20 minutes earlier, laughing under his breath. But admitting she'd noticed meant admitting she'd been standing close enough to see it. And noticing things was not something people like her were supposed to do. A security guard was already moving toward her when a low voice cut through the noise. Not loud, but somehow the only sound in the room. "She's right. The bracelet is in Miss Duthers' cousin's coat. Check the left pocket." The man who said it hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even fully turned from the shadow of the terrace doors. But the room went still, the way water goes still, before it freezes. Marin didn't recognize him. She knew most of the faces that mattered at events like this, but this man was new to her. Tall, dark-suited, unreadable, standing exactly where the light didn't quite reach. Camille's face went white. The guard found the bracelet within 90 seconds. Nobody apologized to Marin. Nobody ever did. But as the crowd dissolved back into careless laughter, she caught the stranger watching her, not with pity, but with something colder and more precise, like a man cataloging a detail he hadn't expected to find. She thanked him with a small nod and turned back toward the kitchen, because thanking men like that with words never ended well for women like her. What she didn't know was that the stranger's name was Damien Voss, that half the guests in that ballroom owed their silence or their lives to him, and that the charity foundation hosting tonight's gala carried his family's name. What Damien didn't know was that the caterer's assistant with sugar on her hands had spent 4 months quietly copying financial records from the foundation's back office, searching for the exact kind of irregularity that had gotten her sister killed 3 years ago in a car accident Marin had never fully believed was an accident at all. She slipped into the kitchen corridor, smoothing down her apron, telling herself the incident was over. It wasn't. In the inside pocket of her uniform, folded twice, was a photocopied wire transfer she had taken from the foundation's private office 20 minutes before Camille had tried to have her arrested. If anyone had searched her instead of the coat across the room, her entire reason for being in that building would have unraveled in front of the one man with the power to bury her for it. 2 floors above the ballroom, in an office no guest was allowed to enter, a different silence was breaking. A man named Rourke, the person Damien trusted more than his own family, stood over an open safe that should have been empty, staring at the space where one particular folder used to be. Rourke didn't call Damien that night. He waited 3 days, running his own quiet search through the staff roster, until he found the name of the caterer's assistant, who'd been standing closest to the private office wing during the gala. Marin Ashcroft, 29. No criminal record, freelance pastry work, a 6-year gap in her employment history, nobody had bothered to question. Damien looked twice. That was the difference between him and every other man in that ballroom. He hadn't planned to think about her again. But the way she'd stood there, spine straight, refusing to shrink, with 200 people staring, had stayed lodged somewhere he didn't examine often. So when his coordinator mentioned the same catering company had been booked for a private dinner, at his Tribeca residence. Damien didn't cancel it. He made sure he'd be informed the moment she arrived. Maren didn't know any of this when she walked through the service entrance of a townhouse she'd been told belonged to a major donor, and didn't expect the same unreadable man from the gala in the kitchen doorway. "You're the one who caught the bracelet," he said. "Not a question. You're the one who spoke up." She kept her hands moving, plating chocolate tartlets. "I didn't get to thank you properly. So, thank you. You didn't need it. You'd have proven it yourself eventually." He said it the way other men said the weather. Flat, certain. "You noticed the cousin's coat before I did." Most people in that room wouldn't have noticed anything, except which way to look away. "Some of us don't have the luxury of not noticing things," Maren said, chest tightening. "Is that an accusation, Miss Ashcroft, or an excuse?" His voice stayed flat, but the question landed with an edge. "I've had staff invent all kinds of stories to explain why they were somewhere they shouldn't have been. I wasn't inventing anything. I was doing my job while everyone else in that room decided I was invisible." She finally stopped moving her hands and looked at him directly. "If you brought me here to test whether I'd apologize for noticing a thief, you can stop waiting." "I won't." He studied her a moment too long, something shifting behind his eyes, then said, "No, I don't imagine you will," and left without asking her name, as if he already knew it. It was Rourke who told her his name minutes later, sliding into the kitchen under the guise of checking service. "Mr. Voss appreciated your composure the other night," he said, pleasant, easy. Damien Voss. Maren had heard whispers about the Voss family, real estate on paper, something else underneath. "I hadn't realized this was his home. Most people don't, until they need to." Rourke smiled, but his eyes didn't. "You have quite the memory for detail. We value discretion in this house." Something flickered behind his easy tone, brief and bitter, before he added, almost to himself, "Loyalty in this family gets rewarded slowly, if it gets rewarded at all." "I'd know." He said it lightly, and moved on, before Maren could ask what he meant. She filed it away, without understanding why it unsettled her. "Discretion is my job," she said instead, meaning it in a way Rourke couldn't possibly know. She left through the service entrance at 11, without seeing Damien again, though she felt his attention like a draft from a door left open somewhere, impossible to locate. What she didn't see was Damien at his study window, watching her walk to the street, already deciding a woman who noticed stolen bracelets and swallowed her fear in front of strangers was not someone he wanted disappearing into the anonymous churn of caterers who came and went twice a month. He told his assistant the next morning to book the same pastry chef for every function going forward, telling himself it was because good staff was hard to find. He did not tell himself the truth, that in the folder Rourke had quietly reopened that week, a discrepancy traced back to the exact office wing Maren had been standing closest to, and Damien Voss did not believe in coincidences. The discrepancy Rourke found was small enough to bury, and large enough to matter. $40,000 routed through a shell vendor that didn't exist, time-stamped to a window when the private office had supposedly been locked. Rourke brought it to Damien himself, framing it as routine, nothing urgent. He did not mention that the security log showed a service door opening for 90 seconds that same night. The same 90 seconds Maren had been unaccounted for near the auction wing. Damien noticed anyway. He always noticed what Rourke chose not to say. He didn't confront her. Instead, 3 weeks slid by in which Maren found herself booked for nearly every private event the Voss family hosted. Each time, he appeared somewhere in the kitchen's periphery, watching her work the way a man studies a lock he hasn't decided whether to pick. The test came on a Thursday, when Damien's cousin Theo choked on shellfish during a private dinner, and nobody reacted fast enough. Maren was already moving, before she'd decided to move, hands finding the position she'd learned in a first aid course, taken the year her sister died. Two sharp thrusts and Theo was coughing, alive, and the room exhaled at once. Damien hadn't moved from his chair the entire time. He'd watched her instead. "Where did you learn that?" he said afterward, eyes not leaving her face. "Everyone should know it. Not everyone bothers to learn it. You did. Recently enough, your hands remembered it without thinking. That's not a class you take because a job requires it." She said nothing, because the truth, that she'd learned it 11 months after paramedics failed to save her sister, was not a truth she handed to strangers, especially not to men who ran background checks on caterers. That night, after the guests left, Damien found Rourke waiting in the study, with a folder open on the desk. "The 40,000, Rourke said. "I traced the shell vendor. It leads to an account, closed 2 years ago. Whoever pulled that money did it carefully, professionally. And the door," Damien said, not a question, "opened from the inside. No forced entry." Rourke hesitated, the kind of hesitation Damien had learned over 15 years to distrust completely. "I don't have proof it was her. I have proximity. That's all." He said it evenly, but something calculating moved behind his eyes, the look of a man quietly measuring how much a woman with sharp instincts and access to this house might eventually see. "Proximity is usually enough," Damien said quietly, "until it isn't." He closed the folder himself, uncertain in a way he rarely allowed anyone to see. "Keep watching. Don't touch her. Not yet." Rourke nodded and left. And if Damien noticed the flicker crossing his oldest friend's face before the door shut, he filed it away as nothing, telling himself loyalty this old didn't need questioning. He was wrong. He simply didn't know it yet. 2 miles across the city, Maren spread 3 photocopied documents across her kitchen table and stared at a name she hadn't expected to find, connected to the Shell account at all. Not Damien Voss. Rourke's name, buried 2 signatures deep, on a wire authorization from the same week the account had closed. The same offhand bitterness she'd heard him mention about loyalty never quite paying out. Her hands, the same hands that had just saved a stranger's life without hesitation, went very still. Maren didn't sleep that night, spreading the documents across her table until 3 in the morning, cross-referencing dates and signatures. Rourke's name kept surfacing adjacent to the money, never quite touching it directly. It wasn't proof. It was a shape, and Maren had learned that shapes like this got people killed before they became proof. She learned more about Damien over the following 2 weeks, not because she asked, but because proximity built its own intimacy. She learned he ate almost nothing at his own dinners, that he stood at the edge of every room, as though trained never to have his back exposed. The jealousy surfaced first, unexpectedly, at a smaller dinner, where a young diplomat named Alexei Rostova spent 20 minutes leaning over the dessert station, laughing too easily at everything Maren said, resting a hand on the counter far closer to hers than the plating required. She didn't notice Damien at first. She noticed the room going quiet instead, the way it had gone quiet the night of the bracelet, and when she looked up, Damien was standing in the doorway with a stillness that had nothing relaxed in it. He didn't cross the room. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, to Alexei, without looking away from Maren, "The dessert course is finished. You should return to your table." And the diplomat straightened so fast, he nearly knocked over a wine glass, muttering an apology to a man he clearly understood, instantly, not to cross twice. "That wasn't necessary," Maren said, once the kitchen had emptied. "Wasn't it?" Damien's jaw was tight, his voice controlled in the particular way that meant it was costing him something to keep it that way. He had no business touching anything on that counter that wasn't his. "I can handle a diplomat with wandering hands, Damien." "I know you can!" He looked at her, like the admission surprised him as much as it did her. "That isn't why I said it." He left without explaining further, and Maren stood alone amid cooling desserts, understanding, with a clarity that unsettled her, exactly what she'd just watched. A man who didn't do jealousy the way other men did. Loudly, sloppily, but quietly, precisely, like everything else he owned. One evening after, staying late to finish inventory, she found him alone, in a music room she hadn't known existed, one hand resting on piano keys he wasn't pressing. "I didn't know you played," she said before she could stop herself. "I don't, not anymore." He didn't look up. "My brother did. This was his room. I'm sorry," she said simply, turning to leave. "You didn't ask how," he said, stopping her. "Everyone always asks how. It wouldn't bring him back. And it's not mine to know, unless you want to give it to me." "He trusted the wrong person," Damien said finally, closing the piano lid. "That's all anyone needs to know." It was the most human she had ever seen him, and it terrified her more than his coldness ever had. The rift came 4 days later, at a fundraiser, where Camille cornered Marin near the dessert table. "I heard Damien's been keeping you very busy. Does he pay extra for company after the desserts are plated?" "Careful, Camille," Damien said from behind Marin, colder than she'd ever heard him. "You're the one with a thief for a cousin." It should have felt like defense. Instead, Marin felt something go cold. Because he hadn't defended her, he'd weaponized the moment to punish Camille. "You should be more careful who you decide is worth defending," she said, sharper than she meant. "I don't need you to fight my battles. I need people to stop deciding what I am before they've asked." She walked away before he could answer, and for the first time, he let her go without a word, wondering why the one person who'd never asked him for anything had just made him feel, for the first time in years, that he'd gotten something badly wrong. Rourke moved 3 days after the argument in the ballroom, timing it the way a man times something he's been planning for weeks. He waited until Damien was distracted by a business trip to Boston, then arranged a routine audit of household access logs. He made sure the discrepancy in the Foundation's records led somewhere specific. He made sure it led to Marin. The wire authorization with his name on it disappeared from the file. In its place, a new document appeared, backdated, showing an access code used to enter the private office the night of the gala, a code matching the temporary credentials issued to catering staff. Only one caterer had been in the building during that 90-second window. Rourke made certain of that too. Damien returned from Boston to find Rourke waiting with the folder open. "I didn't want to believe it either," Rourke said, and the lie sat naturally in his mouth. "But the access code is hers. I think she's been building a case against the Foundation for months. I think she came here looking for exactly this." Damien stared at the folder for a long time. Underneath the cold arithmetic of evidence, a stubborn part of him kept replaying the music room. Her voice. "It's not mine to know, unless you want to give it to me." That part of him didn't want this to be true. He silenced it anyway, because he had buried a brother for trusting the wrong person once, and had promised himself he would never repeat that mistake. He called her into his study the following evening. "You've been accessing my private office," he said. No preamble, sliding the folder across the desk. Under a login issued to catering staff. "I want to know why." Marin's stomach dropped, understanding instantly that someone had built this using her own investigation as scaffolding for her destruction. "This isn't right. Someone altered this. I never used that entry code. I don't even have access to that door. The logs say otherwise. The logs are wrong, or someone made them wrong. Damien, I know how this looks, but I swear to you, I didn't do this. Don't." The word came out harder than he intended. "I've heard enough people swear things to know it means nothing." He looked at her the way he had the first night, cataloging, cold, except now there was something underneath that looked almost like grief. "You're done here. I'd like you gone from this house within the hour." Marin could have begged. She thought about it for exactly 1 second, and then she thought about every person who'd ever decided her worth without asking a single honest question, and she straightened her spine instead. "You've already decided," she said quietly. "There's nothing I can say that changes a decision you made before I walked in here." She untied her apron, folded it once, set it on the edge of his desk. "I hope whoever built that folder for you sleeps well tonight, Mr. Voss, because it certainly wasn't me." She left without looking back. Rourke watched her go from the hallway, allowing himself the smallest, most private smile. Damien sat alone in his study, long after her footsteps faded, staring at the folder, at the flower smudge on his desk's edge, telling himself he'd done the only reasonable thing a man in his position could do. It was Theo, 3 days later, still shaken and grateful from the night Marin had saved his life, who found original security footage on a server Rourke had forgotten still existed, tucked away and unwiped. 90 seconds of grainy video showing the private office door opening from the inside, and the person standing in the doorway wearing Rourke's own signet ring. Theo didn't understand what he was looking at, not at first. He'd only gone digging through the old server out of some strange impulse to relive the night a stranger had saved his life. What he found instead was 90 seconds of a door opening from the inside, a hand reaching for the light switch, a signet ring catching the glow before the frame cut to static. He recognized the ring immediately. He'd seen it on Rourke's hand at every family dinner, every holiday, his entire life. Theo sat still in the dim server room for 20 minutes before he understood the weight of what he was holding. Then did the only thing that made sense to a young man who owed his life to a woman his family had just thrown out onto the street. He went straight to Damien. Damien watched the footage 4 times. Each time, the same ring, the same door that supposedly required Marin's stolen access code, but had clearly been opened by someone already standing inside. When he finally looked up, his face had gone the particular kind of still people who worked for him had learned to fear more than shouting. "Where is she?" he said. "Not a question. Nobody's heard from her since she left," Theo said. "I checked. Nothing." Damien was doing the arithmetic he should have done 3 days earlier. Arithmetic that required admitting the man he'd trusted for 15 years had built an entire case out of nothing, to destroy the one person who'd never once lied to him. He thought about her voice in his study. "You've already decided." He'd mistaken her composure for guilt. He understood now it had been dignity, the specific dignity of someone who'd learned to live without being believed. Rourke found him 20 minutes later, and whatever he saw in Damien's face told him something had shifted. "You found something," Rourke said carefully. "I found the door footage, your ring, your hand on the switch. Care to explain how a fired caterer supposedly used your credentials from outside, while you were already standing inside?" The silence stretched long enough that Damien understood there would be no clean explanation. Rourke's hand moved slowly toward his jacket, and for one terrible second, Damien thought he might reach for a weapon in his own study, in the house he'd grown up in. Instead, Rourke laughed, quiet and humorless. 15 years, and you're going to burn all of it, because a pastry chef made you feel something for the first time since Julian died. The name landed like a blade, deliberate. "I did what I did because your father promised me a share of this empire before he died, and you buried that promise, the same week you buried him. I built the shell accounts to take what I was owed. When I needed a scapegoat, she was standing right there. Convenient. Nothing more. Where is the money now?" Damien said, voice dangerously quiet. "Gone. You'll never trace it in time to matter." Rourke straightened his jacket. "The real question is whether that woman is still in the city, or whether the men I hired to make sure she never talks have already found her." Damien was across the room before Rourke finished, hand at his throat, every careful wall of control finally shattering at once. "If anything happens to her," he said, low, lethal, "there will be nowhere on this earth I don't find you." Across the city, bags half packed, a bus ticket to Albany folded in her coat pocket, Marin heard a knock that didn't sound like a delivery. Through the peephole, Two men she'd never seen stood far too still in her hallway, and her hand went immediately to the second phone hidden in her bag, the one she'd bought with cash for exactly this possibility, the one holding every document she'd gathered in 4 months. Maren didn't scream. Screaming would tell the men in her hallway she was afraid, and fear was a currency she refused to hand to anyone who hadn't earned it. She moved with the same quiet precision that had once saved Theo's life, sliding the phone into her coat lining, gathering her folder into a grocery bag, unlatching the fire escape window she'd tested the week she moved in, because a woman who'd lost a sister to someone else's carelessness never trusted a single exit. She was 3 buildings away, breathing hard in the shadow of a shuttered bakery, when her burner phone lit up with a number she didn't recognize. She answered anyway, and the voice was Theo's, breathless, begging her to trust him for exactly as long as it took to say one sentence. "Damien knows the truth. Rourke set you up. Please, wherever you are, don't go home." She spent the night in an all-night diner in Queens, watching the door, replaying every conversation with Damien since the gala, searching for the moment she should have seen this coming, and finding, to her own quiet devastation, that she hadn't wanted to see it coming at all. It was near dawn when Damien found her, tracing the diner from a security camera 2 blocks from her apartment, arriving alone, without Rourke, without bodyguards. "I should have believed you," he said, stripped of the control he usually wore like armor. "I've spent 5 years believing trust gets you killed. I applied that to you, and I was wrong, and I don't know how to say that in a way that undoes what it cost you."
"You can't undo it," Maren said, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "You chose the evidence over the person who'd never lied to you." She wrapped both hands around her cold coffee.
"Do you know why I really took that catering job, Damien?" He shook his head, bracing for something he couldn't control. "My sister died 3 years ago. Car accident, they called it. She'd told me 2 weeks before that she'd found a discrepancy in the books at the foundation she worked for. She never told me which foundation. I only found out 4 months ago that it was yours." The air went still. "The Voss Foundation. I didn't come here for revenge on you," Maren said. "I came to find out if someone at your foundation had gotten my sister killed for finding exactly the money trail I ended up finding myself. I never expected the rest of it." Damien sat with that, grief and guilt braiding together into something he didn't have a name for. "Rourke, your sister's accident. If the timeline matches the accounts he was running, then this goes deeper than money. Then he didn't just steal from your family," Maren finished. "He killed someone to keep it quiet." An old radio crackled behind the counter with a late-night bulletin, and neither paid attention until the words "small plane crash" and "presumed dead 5 years ago" cut through the static. The barista turned up the volume out of idle curiosity, and Damien's body went rigid at the name the reporter said next, a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in half a decade, a name he'd buried at 17 and never once considered might still be walking around alive. His brother's name. The reporter's voice kept going, oblivious to what it had just detonated in a Queens diner at 5 in the morning. Small aircraft, registered under private charter. Wreckage identified after years of inconclusive investigation. 1 passenger confirmed alive, receiving treatment under private care. Julian Voss, 29 years old, missing since a crash previously ruled fatal 5 years prior. Damien didn't move for almost a full minute. "He's alive," he said, like the words didn't belong in his mouth. "Julian trusted the wrong person. That's what I told you. I meant Rourke. I've spent 5 years believing he helped me survive my brother's death, when he was the one who arranged it." His hands, always so controlled, were shaking. "If Julian is alive, Rourke has known this whole time. He let me grieve a lie for 5 years, while he built an empire on my brother's supposed death. They didn't wait for sunrise before they were moving. Damien calling in the only men he was certain hadn't been compromised. Marin refusing to be left behind in some safe house, while the truth she'd chased for 3 years finally came apart at the seams. Rourke, when they found him, was in the Foundation's private office, systematically destroying decades of paper trail with a small, efficient shredder. When Damien walked in with Marin, 3 steps behind. "You kept him alive," Damien said, quiet in the way that had once terrified grown men twice his age. 5 years. "You let me bury an empty casket while my brother sat under your control." "He wasn't under my control," Rourke said, not bothering to deny it anymore. "He was insurance. Your father promised me a share the day Julian was born, said the boy would run the legitimate side, and I'd run what your father couldn't stomach doing himself. Then your father died. You took over, and you buried that promise with him. Julian was the only leverage I had left. So you staged a crash, let a boy who trusted you disappear for 5 years. I gave him a good life, safer than the one you were building for this family. All cruelty and control, and no room for anyone who might actually love you honestly." His eyes cut to Marin. "Ask her what it felt like to be discarded the second you found evidence inconvenient. That's the man you've spent your life becoming." Marin didn't flinch. "The difference is, he came back for me," she said evenly. "You've spent 5 years running from what you did. That's not strength. That's just a longer kind of cowardice." Rourke's hand moved fast, faster than a man his age should have been able to move, and the gun that came up swung toward Marin, the one person who could still testify to everything he'd destroyed to build what he had. Theo, who'd insisted on coming despite Damien's order to stay behind, threw himself between Marin and the gun with the same reckless instinct that had nearly gotten him killed by a piece of shellfish weeks earlier. The shot caught his shoulder instead of her chest, and he went down hard, blood spreading dark across his shirt, the entire room stopping to breathe at once. Damien was on Rourke before he could fire again, disarming him with brutal, practiced efficiency, while Marin was already on her knees beside Theo, hands pressed hard against the wound, the way she'd once pressed against a stranger's chest, to save a life she had no obligation to save, refusing to let go, even as her hands turned red, refusing to believe the boy who'd risked everything to warn her might be the price this truth had finally demanded. The ambulance took 11 minutes, though it felt to Marin like 11 years, her hands pressed against Theo's shoulder, counting his breaths aloud, refusing to let the fear in her chest show on her face. Damien had Rourke pinned against the wall, gun kicked away, 2 trusted men flooding the room, and still some fractured part of him kept glancing toward Marin and Theo, instead of the man who'd spent 5 years destroying his family from the inside. "Go with him," Marin said, when the paramedics lifted Theo onto the stretcher, his hand weakly gripping hers. "Damien, go. I'll handle this." "I'm not leaving you in a room with him," Damien said, low, dangerous. "You're not leaving your cousin to wake up alone because you're busy proving a point to a man who's already lost," Marin said, steady, despite the blood drying on her hands. "I've been building this case for 3 years. Let me finish it." Something passed between them, a silent negotiation of trust rebuilt in real time, and Damien left with Theo, choosing, for the first time in longer than he could remember, the people who needed him over the war that had defined him. What followed became the thing the organization would whisper about for years. Marin didn't threaten Rourke. She didn't need to. She laid out, calmly, every document she'd gathered in 3 years. The shell accounts, the wire authorizations, the timeline connecting his signature to the week her sister discovered irregularities and died in an accident that had never quite made sense. "I could have gone to the police the day I found it," she said. "I didn't, because I wanted to understand why. Now I do. You didn't just steal money, Mr. Rourke. You killed a woman who was 26, and terrified, and doing what she thought was right, and let an innocent man bury his own brother for 5 years, to protect yourself." She met his eyes without flinching. "You're not walking out of this the way you walked in." By the time Damien returned from the hospital, Theo stable, the bullet removed, Rourke was already in federal custody, contacted by Marin, quietly months earlier, back when she'd believed she might have to bring this case forward alone. The fallout took days to settle. Julian, recovered from years believing his survival required silence, arrived at the hospital, desperate to see the brother he'd been told would kill him if he ever surfaced. The reunion happened without an audience, in a corridor at 2 a.m, and whatever passed between them belonged only to them. The organization's board learned within a week that a woman they'd dismissed as catering staff had exposed a 15-year betrayal at the heart of their empire. Camille herself, cornered by acquaintances eager for gossip, found herself unable to summon a single insult in the room where Marin stood, quietly, simply present. It was Damien who found her afterward, in the same music room where he'd once told her about his brother, without knowing his brother was still alive. He sat at the piano, pressed one key, the first note he'd played since Julian's supposed death, and let it hang in the air between them. "I spent 5 years building walls because I thought love was the thing that got people killed," he said finally. "I was wrong. It wasn't love that killed my brother. It was the absence of trust. The same absence I nearly repeated with you." He turned to face her fully. "I don't know how to ask you to stay after everything I did, but I don't want to build anything else in this life without you standing in the room." Marin thought about her sister, about grief rebuilt into purpose, about the one man who'd finally, at the cost of nearly everything, asked instead of assumed. "Then stop deciding things for me," she said quietly, "and start asking." "Will you stay?" Damien said. And for the first time in his life, the question sounded less like a command and more like a man laying down a weight he could no longer carry alone. Sembaran said yes, quietly, in the music room where a piano had sat untouched for 5 years, and the sound Damien made was closer to a man, setting down a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten what his shoulders felt like without it. Rourke's trial moved through federal court, with the same quiet documentation Marin had assembled over 3 years, laid bare before a courtroom that had no choice but to convict him on all counts. She did not cry when the verdict came. She had done her crying 3 years earlier, alone, with a folder of her sister's old emails, and by the time justice arrived, it felt less like relief and more like a door quietly closing. Julian's recovery took longer. 5 years of hiding leaving scars. A single reunion couldn't undo. But the brothers rebuilt what Rourke had tried to destroy. Slowly, the way anything worth keeping has to be rebuilt. Julian took over the legitimate side of the family's holdings, and Damien, for the first time since he was 17, discovered what it felt like to run an empire without carrying the weight of it alone. Camille Duthers, whose cruelty had opened this story on a ballroom floor months earlier, found herself quietly uninvited from the following year's gala, and when she tried once to approach Marin with some brittle attempt at friendliness, Marin simply excused herself with the same composed dignity she'd carried through every humiliation before, needing no audience to know her worth now. The Voss Foundation was restructured within 6 months, transparent audits built into its bylaws, a scholarship fund established in her sister's name for young women pursuing forensic accounting, the exact career Marin had abandoned in grief and quietly returned to as a consultant, this time with an empire's resources behind her, instead of a shoebox of photocopies and a burner phone. The proposal happened in the kitchen of the Tribeca townhouse, the kitchen where she'd once plated 30 identical tartlets, while a stranger watched from the doorway without introducing himself. Damien had learned by then that grand gestures meant less to her than honest ones, so he set a small velvet box on the counter beside her mixing bowl and said nothing, letting her find it in her own time, the way she'd found everything else, on her own terms. "You're doing it again," she said, laughing despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "Deciding things without asking." "I'm not deciding anything," Damien said, taking her flour-dusted hand in his. "I'm asking. I've just gotten better at not needing an answer immediately." He knelt anyway, because some traditions were worth honoring, even for a man who'd spent his life avoiding vulnerability. "Marry me, Maren. Not because I need you to complete anything in me. Because I finally understand what it means to choose someone, every day, instead of simply controlling what's already mine." She said yes with flour still on her hands, the hands that had saved a stranger's life without hesitation, the hands that had built a case powerful enough to bring down a 15-year betrayal, the hands Damien pressed to his lips, like the only thing in his empire he had ever truly wanted to hold on to. At their wedding, a year later, in the garden of the same townhouse where she'd once been nearly accused of theft, Camille was not on the guest list, but 200 people who had once looked through Maren like glass now watched her walk down an aisle toward a man who no longer needed to rescue her, only to choose her. She had simply needed someone willing to ask instead of assume, to trust instead of control, to love her because of the strength she had quietly carried all along. Damien Voss had built his life on the belief that power meant never needing anyone. It took losing nearly everything to learn that real power was choosing, freely, to need one person completely, and to be loved by her in return, not because he commanded it, but because he had finally, painfully, become a man worth choosing.